and out. So, you know, there's this kind of ebb and flow with deciduous trees where you're wanting that broad, rounded crown, but then you also need to cut back at points to get and maintain interior shoots and compactness. So I've been trying to take out some thicker, coarser branches, which at the top there's quite a bit of them since it's such a apically dominant tree up there. And the bark is this like winged elm, so it has this really quirky bark on younger twigs, which makes it look just visually more heavy up there, and on the older branches that sort of falls away, so you can kind of see the smoothness of it. So I'm kind of see the proportion of the top now. The crown has been brought in a little bit. It's not as full and round, and so you can also kind of see where I've been. At least I can in the middle. There's still that width, and it's a little bit too symmetrical. So the main thing I'm looking at is on the left there. There's that branch that kind of really sticks out. It's the longest point on the left. And then there's also a long point, the longest point on the right. So it's kind of symmetrical at that point. And that's kind of where I've gotten to on the tree, but I'm needing to probably bring in the right a little bit because that branch on the left is really nice. I could also maybe try to wire it down a little bit so that it doesn't stick out so horizontally and maybe get a little more downward movement. But there's another branch on the right there that kind of just comes up and straight goes out. That could be reduced a little bit to kind of bring that side in. But it's kind of long, so I mean, you could maybe put a wire and maybe kind of have it go back in that area so it's not so long here, and that might be helpful since it's not right above that branch. So if we moved it a little bit more that way, that could be a solution instead of cutting it, because I've already reduced it a little bit. I don't want to start. I could probably cut it back to this one, which I'm probably going to do. No. So this will help create some more directionality, and I reduced the vigor of that one because we're also trying to get taper, right? Transition from thick to thin. And so when you have the repetitive pruning of the tips here, you get the coarseness, thickness occurring that just causes that visual imbalance. Whereas down here, where it's weaker, the taper is much more gradual and the branching is much more delicate. So to create a little bit more not even spacing, but more openness to the tree, a little bit lighter. There were some larger branches removed, but then I left everything else out in the exterior. So now I'm trying to gradually chase in the exterior branches that are left. But you don't want to prune it so hard that you lose the ramification that's been built up over decades. So this is kind of the ideal time to prune deciduous, is as they're transitioning to dormancy, and so kind of there's a window as the leaves are falling, and so most of the leaves have fallen off of this. I'm removing some, but the tree hasn't fully gone dormant yet, so it's a good time to cut and make these cuts so that there's still some movement of resources, and I'm not making major cuts, but the wounds can be kind of compartmentalized rather in the dead of winter, and there's not going to be a whole lot of ability for that plant to protect itself from the wounds that have been made. So minor wounds, but this is just in general, this is the good time for deciduous pruning. Window. If a tree has fully dropped its leaves, the general window is like 2 weeks, right? You kind of have a 10 to 14 day window to prune, kind of following the leaf drop, but you're not waiting for if the tree just has one little leaf on it, you're like, oh, I can't prune it because it hasn't dropped all of its leaves. It's kind of at a state kind of like flowering, right? It's majority of the blossoms have bloomed, majority of the leaves have turned color and fallen off. So that's kind of where I'm looking at it and saying, okay, most of it has, there's a few, there's some that still haven't, but I'm not going to wait for every leaf to drop, and then just the cleaning of it like we're doing, and pruning of it kind of go tandem, because this is just part of then that winter cleanup, right? These leaves will fall off, and you don't want them just falling off in a place that would require us to continually clean it up. So it's just the standard kind of fall maintenance for a more, a refined bonsai tree that has this level of ramification. Is lighter trimming with some larger cutbacks to help improve the ramification. Younger, the type of bark that it has produces these wings of bark, and then as it ages, these get less dramatic. They slowly fall away, and then you're left with a more smoother, older texture, which is what we're going for. And so the challenge is that this corky tissue adds a lot of visual width to, and makes the branches look thicker than they are, especially at the top, which is where it's the most vigorous. You have the youngest bark, the youngest branches, and so trying to balance that is kind of part of the uniqueness of the species. And so in some cases what I'm actually doing is like I'm like cutting off the winged bark, like right here, like I can kind of break that off to where it's not as visually kind of massive, because it does, while it's cool to a point, I think it just causes too much like thickness in the branch, especially contrasting the lower branches, which are much more delicate and thinner. And so trying to have that differentiation to a point, like we see it's cool to see it on the younger branches, but when it's so thick and heavy at the top, it becomes more of a challenge to manage. To occur closer together, so like the distance between the division from there to there, like that's good. And you want to have it, having it intermixed and some variation. It doesn't want to be a pattern, it doesn't need to be so much, but a better branch is going to divide further back, right? But having branches kind of on the same tier, getting a lot of these whorls like right here is a problem, because we've got 1, 2, and then 3, 4 at this level. That's causing this to swell. So if we're trying to maintain taper, if we leave all these branches here, this section of trunk will get thicker and thicker and thicker, and it's already kind of happening. You can see it. And so that's a result of having so many branches that are adding to the size and the growth of that location, that you have to gradually remove. Well, firstly eliminate if you prevent them from setting up, but then if you have them, which ones do you keep, which ones do you remove, so that you're not just resetting the apex and losing all this age of the upper canopy. But how do you preserve the trunk? Because you can see right below it, this is that inverse taper, right? It's narrower here at this line, and then it starts to flare and bulge out because all of these branches are contributing to that flare. So that's why we only really ever want one branch, and the trunk essentially. One branch, at every level, because then you're going to get, and that's just why this flares out here, is because this branch is adding to that tissue being added every year. Same thing here. This is why this is thicker and this is thicker, and you can just see up the trunk. So a lot of the branches that were initially removed, that's where the bar branches occur, right? Branches that are at the same level, then if you have them all there, one of them typically has to be taken out, and then that's where you get into old trees that that branches that have been, you can't correct every flaw like on an old tree. It's gonna have flaws, and that's kind of its character. But where we have the apex where it's so strong, we have a lot of branches at that level, it's like, well, which one goes? Because they're all kind of important to keeping this overall silhouette and density, But at the same time, in the long run, this is gonna eventually get thicker, and in a lot of cases it's thicker, like this section here, right? There to there. This is the narrowing, and then we get branches and it flares out again, and then it narrows and flares. So playing with the front, we can sort of hide that, or removing some of the branches helps to slow that thickening down. So it's just that kind of balancing act of what can you take off, what can you leave, with that long view of like, something will have to be done, otherwise this will eventually adversely impact the quality of the tree much more than if we cut that off now and it have kind of a bare spot for a while. Right? You have to kind of weigh your options. So like taking one of these two off could be an option. We would probably take, if I had to choose between these two, it'd be this one, because the movement on this branch is much better. It's got much nicer movement, even though the division occurs further back on this one. For the size of the branch in terms of its relationship and just the movement of it, I would prefer to keep this one, also because this one is directly above this branch, so there's some competing. You can just see how thicker and more vigorous this branch is than this branch, and so by removing this or even cutting it back to this smaller piece here, this would help this gain a little bit more vigor. It would also, by reducing this, would help slow down the thickening at the trunk. But then, you know, if we were to hypothetically remove both of these, because we have one, you know, we have 4 at this level, and even like kind of a big one here adding to that a little bit further up. If we take this whole unit off, then there's a pretty big gap in the branch structure that either this would need to come up to kind of fill, or this would have to kind of be brought down, which is not the best solution, or this would have to maybe be brought over a little bit to kind of fill in. So I don't know if that's the best option. So you kind of have to go through and just problem solve and like see what you could do, given kind of what you have or what you have around it. So it's again kind of weighing those options, and you know, maybe that does become one of the solutions. So, you know, do you just cut back to that now? Do you maybe take a larger reducing cut now, hoping to maybe generate some back budding here that you could maybe build this branch and keep it a little bit shorter in the future? There's a few different options as well. Just even then how you make that transition, because you have this very prominent branch right above it that, you know, if you can visualize taking something out, you know, and having something just brought down a little bit to take its place. I mean, these two are competing.
Generally avoid trying to bring them down.
Well, no, you typically do. I mean, that's the direction that we're generally trying to wire branches in a more or less downward kind of style. I mean, you could, well, I guess the reason we wouldn't keep this one is because we're trying to eliminate something from this nodule, right? So yeah, either this could be brought down, or yeah, this could be brought up. So we have 2 options for if we removed it, right? And if we did remove this one, this would give us a little bit more kind of a little bit more of a window towards maybe something back here that we would be able to bring down and kind of create some depth. And then just looking at the overall tree, right? We talked about, like, there is kind of a big gap here. I do want to probably wire this up and over a little bit to close that down. And so what I'm trying to say is it's a little bit lighter on this side up here. So if it's heavier over here, it would be helpful to have another little window kind of created with the removal of that branch.
Right.
So those are kind of some of the thoughts that go into that.